Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a goddess hidden deep within the bowels of the earth, whose job and vocation it is to treasure and store up your most wondrous personal secrets, waiting for the time until they are ready to fruit and bud above the earth. Here to talk to you today about Venus retrograde. Retrogrades are very important moments in any planetary cycle because they help us to get back in touch with a part of ourselves which we may have become distant, detached, or lost from. When a planet is in direct motion, it is like someone who is always out there traveling in the world, exerting themselves, laboring, working, striving to make things happen, always putting out their energies in an extroverted manner. But in the period leading up to a planetary retrograde, that planet begins to feel fatigued, worn out, jaded, seedy, cynical, a bit like the moon in its final phases before it goes new. It's been so busy putting itself out there that it reaches this point where it goes, I'm exhausted. I don't even know why I'm doing these things anymore. What once began as a natural exposition from my heart has since become something I'm doing out of habit, out of routine, out of ritual. I'm just going through the motions here. I feel like I need to take time to withdraw, to turn away, to hide away, to look back inside myself so I can remind myself of who I really am. So retrogrades are important times when a planet needs to rest and recuperate, where it needs to stop traveling and insisting on forcing itself out there in the world, but needs to be more quiet, introverted, and reflective. A direct planet is not by its nature very reflective because it is too busy being itself to analyze itself or look too closely at its own motivations. If it did that, it would be slowing and hindering itself down. That period of meditation and withdrawal is what the retrograde is all about. So when Venus stations retrograde, those Venusian functions become introverted, doubtful, tentative, and soul-searching in nature. Venus ordinarily during direct motion expresses herself in our lives in both the most superficial and profound ways. The most obvious one being our relationships with other people. Who we love and how we love is a very personal Venusian matter, something that arises from the heart and what we inherently, viscerally care about. But it also expresses itself in our relationship with ourselves, the kind of person we want to be perceived as. Venus cares about our appearance, about appearing beautiful, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And therefore Venus always tries to fashion us in the shape of her own image, according to what we think the idealized beauty should be, and how we choose to manifest and express that in terms of how we care about ourselves, in terms of the clothes we wear, the fashions we're committed to, the different ways in which we ornament ourselves, whether with jewelry, with tattoos, or given body modifications. These are all Venus trying to say, these are the things I love and care about so much that I want them to be visible in terms of how I present myself externally to the world. It is a way in which we try and wear our heart not just on our sleeves, but in our entire visible body. Venus also expresses herself in the things that we choose to spend our money on, because those will be expressive of what we feel is worth collecting, accumulating, or experiencing because we value it or because it brings us pleasure. A typically Venusian Venus might spend a lot of its money on beautiful clothes, on cosmetics, because they make it feel good about itself. A more martial, fiery Venus might care more about having experiences that are empowering, invigorating, and exciting. Spending its money on having karate lessons or going skydiving or, going dirt biking. It wants to create vivid, adventurous memories that get its blood flowing. A more mercurial Venus might spend most of its money on things that satisfy its intellect and its mind. You go into its house and you see bookcases everywhere, or the receipts that it has racked up by going on different courses to increase its knowledge and skill set. So we can see from those few meagre examples that Venus expresses herself in the highest and lowest details of our life, from the people we choose to marry or not to marry and to spend our lives with and to avoid, down to the colour of fingernail polish that we choose to wear. All of these things say something about our taste, about the things that we think are beautiful, pleasurable, pretty, with which we want to associate and identify ourselves. And in order to make those choices about which partners we want, which clothes we want to wear, which things we feel are truly expressive of our innermost heart, we need to be in touch with that heart. We need to have a clear idea of what it is that heart actually wants. Because otherwise we are just floundering in the dark, and perhaps we are not really expressing our own values, the things that we really want, but we are giving in to that collective pressure to instead make a life or make a vision of ourselves that is expressive of what we feel someone else wants us to be, how someone else wants us to appear, and the type of relationships that someone else thinks is respectable and nourishing. It is very easy for Venus to get waylaid while she is out there in direct motion, because she cares usually so much about being liked, about being perceived as beautiful by other people, about getting approval. And if she feels that when she has been herself, when she has been acting from her truest heart, that has not received the love and adulation from other people that she has sought, it can be very easy for her over time to get worn down, to start departing from her own values, and instead to start transmogrifying and shape-shifting herself so that she is a vision of loveliness that someone else will respond to. And while that approval or responsivity that she gets from being inauthentic may at first be pleasurable, because she is getting some kind of reaction from people that is more in accordance with what she expects, if over time she realizes that she is being loved and valued and cherished for someone or something that she is not, the love she is receiving from other people for wearing a mask, for wearing a fake persona, for dressing in a way that feels uncomfortable and unnatural to her, it starts to grate. That love she is receiving, she knows isn't truly for her. It's for an imposter. It's for an illusion that she's created. And that's why she needs those periods of retrograde and withdrawal to ask herself, why am I doing these things? Are they really true to me? Or is it just a bad habit that I've fallen into? Or, are these things that I did once love, that actually I did value, which once truly were expressive of my heart? But are they perhaps things that I've outgrown? These Venus cycles last 18 months at a time. And the person who we were at the beginning of the last Venus cycle 18 months ago may be very different from who we are now a year and a half onwards. And that's why we need that time to pause, reflect, and assess, and get to know the heart, not of the habituated self, but of the self who is here in the present moment, and who may need to find new ways of expressing the things that she loves and values at this juncture in her life. So during Venus retrograde, Venus may wake up in bed one day and start asking herself, are the things that are in my life now and which I'm choosing to do with my life right now actually bringing me any joy and pleasure and sense of self-worth and well-being? She wakes up in her bed and she sees her lover next to her, if she has one, and she says, is this the person I really want to be giving my mind, body and soul to? Is this someone I really want to be in a relationship with or to be spending the rest of my life with? She looks at the clothes in her wardrobe and she asks herself, are these clothes actually saying anything about who I am now? Do I actually enjoy wearing them? Do I feel comfortable with them? Is the way that I interact and, express myself with my friends and lovers actually true to how I would like to be? Suddenly everything becomes a little cloudy, a little murky, a little ambiguous and uncertain. And so this Venus retrograde process in mythology was symbolized in different cultures in different ways. In some, Venus retrograde was personified as Venus descending from the heavens and coming to the earth. It was almost like for a brief period of time, she lost her celestial certainty. She lost some of her natural godliness, her natural radiance, brilliance, and beauty, and instead became a mortal like the rest of us. She had to come back to earth, back to the ground, and go on a journey to figure out who she was now before she was ready to shine with that clarity and the certainty in the heavens once again. In other cultures, the retrograde was personified as Venus going through a process of death and rebirth, where she descended to the underworld. And normally, when you see Venus shining during the sky, she's one of the most beautiful stars that you see. She is a scintillating, flashing sapphire in the darkness of the night sky, this erotic, sensual, stellar beauty. But when she descends below the horizon in to the earth, that awareness of the self becomes clouded, it becomes benighted. She has to go in search of her deeper self before she can confidently express it in those small, external, superficial ways that are actually symbolic of something much deeper and more profound. But the other way of looking at this is to be aware that when Venus stations retrograde, she starts moving back towards the sun in preparation for a conjunction. And as the sun is meant to be the symbol for our most central self, for the unifying consciousness that helps to take all of the disparate, contradictory and piebald parts of us and bring them all together into some kind of unified, clarified cosmos that has a central sense of identity and purpose. It's almost like by Venus turning and approaching the sun, she is asking to be given some light, for some light to be shed back into a heart that may have become obscure and benighted and foreign to her. She's saying, please illuminate those hidden chambers of my heart. Show me what is dwelling there now. Cast out the remnants and the ashes and the zombified remains of those parts of me that are dead and yet carrying on living in a kind of Venusian autopilot. Show me the real life that still beats within my bosom, that still has some kind of meaning, that will actually give me pleasure now, because it's not unusual in the months when Venus is preparing to go retrograde for us to go through these periods where maybe we feel a bit depressed, a bit worn out, a bit jaded and dissatisfied with the Venusian things in our life, where we may even experience a sense of anhedonia, of an inability to take pleasure in things that previously gave us delight and now just don't seem to be able to tap into our senses. It's like Venus is crying out to the sun, let me feel something again, let me feel joy and happiness and cheer and pleasure and orgasmic delight in my body, in my heart, and my senses again, because right now everything is just leaving me a little cold. I want to find out what will stir me now, what will awaken me, what will give me a more vital relationship with life, so that when life embraces me, I actually feel warm and touched and nurtured, and not as though I am just in the cold, restrictive embrace of something that is failing to touch me and reach me. And this is useful because it can also give us time to pay more attention to the things that haven't been feeling right for us. Again, when a planet is in direct motion, it can be so focused on just being itself, on achieving or acquiring or working towards whatever goals it has set for itself, that any doubts or misgivings that it has about its current path, lifestyle, or way of relating or connecting to other people in itself, it's willing to press down. It's going to say, no, if I do that, if I start doubting myself, I'm going to undermine myself. I'll slow myself down. I won't get where I'm going. I need to just keep myself single-pointed. But with the retrograde, suddenly any niggling doubts, anything that doesn't feel right about our life, will no longer be something that we can just shrug off or put aside. It instead becomes this urgent thing that seems to be actively slowing us down. Something that before may have just been a buzzing, irritating gnat, now becomes this big, inarguable obstacle in front of us that says, I need to be faced. This is an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. Not just an elephant in the room, but an elephant, dare I say it, in the heart, which until you face it, no blood will flow through it. Your heart will fail to feel alive. So instead of putting off and procrastinating, looking at those things, we start to address them. And of course, there's a reason that we procrastinate looking at those things, because if we do actually start to address the misgivings or doubts or uncertainties about the validity or the value or the pleasure of anything that we currently have in our life, if we find that there are very real reasons for those doubts, then we have to take action on them. We have to initiate change. And as humans, we are generally fearful of change because we equate it with some kind of death. And this is why Venus does die during a Venus retrograde process, why there has to be some loss and sacrifice of the worn out, irrelevant self, so that we can give birth to a new self that is relevant, that is alert to the possibility of joy and pleasure, and the ability to keep it close to us in this often murky and benighted world. And I would say that retrogrades in general, the reason why we tend to dislike them is precisely because of this death rebirth process. They have that 12th house feel where everything feels like it's sloughing away and dissolving, and yet once we do allow ourselves to release our hold on things that are no longer fulfilling us, nature abhors a vacuum and it leaves space for things that truly do matter to us to come into our life, to take root, to take seed, to be an egg or an embryo that can later hatch and develop as the new Venus cycle begins. For people who are in relationships during Venus retrograde, the way those energies can transform and change those existing relationships can be quite varied depending on how authentic and genuine that relationship is to the need for pleasure and joy of both parties involved. For some people, it may be quite clear-cut. They go through the retrograde, they finally admit that the person who they are with isn't really the right partner for them. They don't really have the same values. They're not really trying to build the same kind of lifestyle together. So it's best just to go. So relationship ending is definitely something that can happen during Venus retrograde, and very often for good reasons. For some people, it's a case of modifying or renewing the existing relationship they are in. They may think to themselves, I love my partner, I definitely do want to be with them and carry on being committed with them, but there is something about the structure of our current relationship that is inhibiting my ability to feel truly close, safe, warm, nurtured, alive, erotic, and present with that other person. And now is the time for facing those obstacles, for taking them apart and asking myself, what can I do to recalibrate this relationship so that that connection can find its spark again. So it's not just a relationship going through the motions that is just stuck in routine and habit, but one that is actually alive and present and passionate in the current moment. So in that latter case, Venus retrograde can actually be a very good time for relationships in which we dedicate our energies to renewing sparks and flames of passions which may have been on the verge of disappearing or being extinguished completely, a way of bringing back some youthful ardour to something that may have become a little too stagnant and tried and tested. For people who are single, I would generally say that Venus retrograde is not a good time for initiating new relationships, at least any that we would like to see last, precisely because we are in a state where we might not actually yet be clear about what it is we really want anymore. And I think especially as Venus is in Leo, when Leo, or indeed any fire sign, feels unsure of itself, it can sometimes respond to that sense of insecurity, to that lack of light, by forcing itself to appear more confident and sure of itself, of what it is, to make up strong desires that it doesn't actually feel. It might say, oh, you know, maybe on the inside I'm not really sure what I want, but I'm sure I do. It's probably the same thing I always want. I guess I'll just throw myself into a situation. I'm sure it will all work out. And yet somehow it just fails to, because the true fire and light hasn't returned yet. In general, as with most retrogrades, it's not a time for making strong decisions. It's about getting in touch with ourselves closely and intimately enough that we can make future decisions based on a genuine self-knowledge and not just out of repetitions of patterns that are now cold and frosty to us. And yet the irony of that sometimes is that I think sometimes if we are single during Venus retrograde, there can be a strong desire to have some romances, to have some moments of passion, in the hopes that by so doing, the spark and the flame and the friction of those encounters will help to re-alight and clarify what we seem to be unable to do by ourselves. It's almost like Venus is feeling fragile, she's feeling insecure, she's feeling uncertain, and so she longs to throw herself into the arms and erotic embrace of another in the hopes that they will have that clarity, that they will be that shining sun who will help to illuminate what is currently dark within them. And sometimes to an extent that does work, in that even if we have brief encounters during the retrograde phase that don't really go anywhere or which prove to be dissatisfying, the distance between how that experience was and what our relationship values actually are can sometimes be clarified by contrast through that experience. We can at least look at that experience and say, that's not what I want, that is not what I am worth more than that. And through that contrast, we can say, well, actually, that means that this is the kind of thing I want in a relationship, or this is the kind of thing that I want from life in general. So it helps us to get those Venusian scales working again. But these Venus retrograde cycles are also so important to pay attention to, because the conclusions that we reach during this retrograde stage, the new versions of ourselves that begin to emerge as Venus stations direct, that clarification of new values and the departure of the old self, is something that will play out over the next 18 months. It's almost like Venus spends that period of retrogression dying and trying to give birth to her new self, and once she goes direct again, it's almost like she says, okay, what we have learned during this retrograde will be the blueprint for what we do over the next 18 months. So when you are looking at a Venus retrograde period in your life, pay close attention to the signs that Venus is transiting through when she goes retrograde, and also pay very close attention to the houses that she is transiting in your natal chart. Because the flavor of those houses and those signs, as well as the big aspects that Venus makes during that retrograde period, will be the dominant energies that play out in the Venusian aspects of your life over the next 18 months. So what begins now determines the energy and approach that we give to relationships, to beauty, to pleasure and passion over the next year and a half. By the tree, you can see the seed, and by the seed, you can see the tree. So what is enwombed during this moment is of utmost importance. For instance, if Venus goes retrograde through your first house, you might want to spend the next portion of the cycle being more extroverted, more outgoing, taking more risks, taking more chances, being adventurous and martial and Aryan and opinionated, that you want to place your relationship with yourself first before anyone else. You want to live a life that is committed to being in the moment. If it's going through the second house, conversely, you might want to live a life that is more sedate and routine and structured, to save up money, to hoard your resources for some greater future goal, so that you feel you are a bit more anchored and secure in the real world. If Venus goes retrograde in your third house, you might want to spend the next 18 months focusing on getting back in touch with your mind and your intellectual interest. You might decide you want to write a book or engage in a new field of study or learn to play a new instrument, and the partners that you attract during that period may mostly be ones who are sapiosexual, who turn on your mind, or who have similar intellectual values to yourself. If Venus goes retrograde in the fourth, you might find that actually you want a bit more safety and security and certainty in relationships. You want someone you can build a life with, a family with, who gives you a sense of being someone you belong with, who you create a nurturing, safe home environment with, who can be a container for your inner life. If Venus goes retrograde in the fifth, then again, this being a fiery house, you might care more about creativity, about leisure, about enjoying yourself, about pleasure, about things that make you feel good about yourself, that are spontaneous, that involve some level of gambling or risk-taking. Conversely, if Venus goes retrograde in your sixth house, you might decide, actually, this is a time for being a bit more careful and attentive to my health and my body, for readjusting and modifying my lifestyle so that it is more healthy, so that my body is more finely tuned and more balanced. Maybe starting out a new diet, a new exercise regime, and being more conscious of the balance between my mind and body, and how those two intersect, and how I can construct a lifestyle that feeds both of them, so that I am performing as an organic yet psychic entity with the utmost optimum capability. If Venus is going retrograde in the seventh, then relationships and passion and love affairs and art and culture are more likely to take the dominant part in your life. If Venus goes retrograde in the eighth, then the next 18 months might develop a particularly plutonic flavour, where the relationships that you form with others have an intense, obsessive, brooding, dangerous quality. You may even be actively attracted to people who are in some way taboo, maybe people you shouldn't be attracted to, or who have a demonic, dangerous quality to them that is exciting, but which feels like it could devour you and destroy you at the same time, where you have strong power struggles and battles of will with other people. If Venus goes retrograde in the ninth, you might decide that you want to spend more time exploring the big ideas of the world, the religions, the philosophies, getting to the grips of what life is actually about when we start looking at the bigger picture, there might be a stronger desire to leave behind the routine, the habitual and the comfortable, and to start exploring more and going on journeys, going on trips, exposing yourself to different cultures, to different lifestyles, or maybe deciding to go to university and expand your mind by exploring a new subject if Venus goes retrograde. In the 10th, then the next 18 months may be all about work and trying to develop a sense of being this authoritative person in the world who is admired and acknowledged by the public at large for their beautiful artistic or pleasure-giving qualities. If Venus goes retrograde in the 11th, then the next Venus cycle may focus more on friendships and what it is like to sacrifice some of your own values so that you can instead focus on developing harmony and working as part of a group or a larger social network or movement which perhaps may be particularly interested in politics or progressive ideals. If Venus goes retrograde in the 12th, then it may feel like the retrograde itself carries on for the next 18 months, where that process of having to shed false or worn out parts of ourselves may be really prolonged, where we really have to spend a lot of time dismantling or detaching and letting go and sacrificing an older lifestyle so that the slate is completely cleared, so we can do a complete overhaul when the Venus cycle that follows that can then live up through. It can be a time of getting really deep into the buried part of your mind and your psyche, of unearthing parts of yourself that may have been hidden or oppressed since your childhood, or where you end up in relationships that have patterns of codependence, but which also at their best may also have a strong mystical flavour, where we feel the boundary between us and the other person becomes slimmer, or where we have a stronger bond through shared spiritual values in a more oniric, mythopoeic way of perceiving the world. To give a personal example, the last Venus retrograde, which was roughly from December 2021 until I think about January 2022, went through Capricorn conjunct Pluto in my 12th house, and it was at that point I started investigating the buried, repressed parts of myself. And what do you know, I discovered I was trans, and have spent the last 18 months relinquishing all the vestiges of the previous person who I had been, the self I was before, and letting go all of the different things that were attached to that so that I could fully commit to becoming the person that I am now. It was a fucking hideous process. Don't want to go through it again, but it also did help me to get where I am now, ready for the next part of the process. I will say also, having gone rather briefly for all of those houses, that it's very often the case that when Venus transits retrograde over about 15 or 18 degrees, it may go through 2 of your houses, in which case the flavours of both of those houses may also play out strongly over the next 18 months. Anyway, that was a bit more cookbook style astrology than I usually do, but I hope for those of you who are wanting a more specific commentary on how this Venus retrograde cycle will affect you will at least be satiated by that. Of course, if you want to know more fully how it is actually operating in your chart, you can always message me, whether in an email or by leaving a comment on here. Please like, share and subscribe to this channel and this video. My contact details are, well, my email is thestarsunraveled@outlook.com, my Instagram is astrologyandunderwear, and my Patreon is www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled. And I hope you all enjoy getting in touch with your new Venus.